Welcome to another video. Tonight we have 7 stories, from tales of Eyesight, Valentine's Day, and much more. I'd like to give a huge thanks to all the authors of these stories for allowing me to share them with all of you. If you have a story of your own, it can be sent to reddit.com/r/slumberreads. These videos do take me quite a bit of time to create, so if you're feeling generous, and if you feel this video is worth one, please be sure to drop a like rating. It helps the channel more than most think. Subscribing if you're new is also greatly appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Last week, I was at work, sitting behind my desk when I saw a bright flash of light in my right eye, and then that entire side of my vision went completely black. Arguably one of the most anxiety-filled moments of my life. I rushed to the hospital, asking my incredible nice coworker if my eye was just maybe stuck closed the whole time. Unfortunately, my eye was open. I was blinking and functioning as normal, and nothing looked amiss from the outside looking in. After hours in the waiting room and a tedious consultation, I left with a diagnosis of a torn cornea. Usually, small scratches to the cornea are avoidable and treatable, but in my case, there wasn't a specific reason that my cornea just completely split in half. It just decided that it could no longer stay in one piece and split wide open, taking my vision with it on the way down. After coming to terms with what had happened and bumping into a great many walls with my one-sided vision, I continued to take care of my eye and scheduled emergency surgery to get it repaired and hopefully return my vision to me. The first few days were normal. I fell into a depressive slump and honestly spent most of my time sleeping. The more time I spent asleep, the less I had to realize that it wasn't a bad dream after all. On the 3rd day, right before surgery, something switched. I had begun crawling out of the depressive depths of my bedroom and tried to go about my life as normal. I got up, showered, put on some nice clothes, and decided to take the dog for a walk. It was on this walk through the neighborhood that something shifted. My dog was understandably incredibly excited to get back to some semblance of normalcy, and was pulling on the leash, begging to go a little faster, or walk a little farther away from what had become our cocoon. I couldn't refuse his pure happiness, and I started to giggle myself as I picked up the pace into a bit of a jog, helping him get all that energy out. Just as I started to enjoy myself, in my right eye I saw a shadow. It wasn't much, and it shouldn't have even been possible, since the entirety of my vision in that eye was pitch black. But this shadow was darker than the black I was already accustomed to. It was an all-consuming sort of darkness, and it started out as a blob in the far reaches of my vision, what could have been my peripheral vision previously. I immediately noticed it, and whirled toward my right to catch a glimpse of whatever it was with my good eye. My dog yelped at the sudden change of pace, but didn't object to changing course. We instead headed in the direction of whatever that shadow blob was. If I was regaining any piece of my vision, I needed to know before I went into surgery that may or may not give that sense back to me. We started walking back down the sidewalk in the direction of the shadow, cutting through my neighbors' backyards in search of a different colored darkness. After 5 minutes, I hadn't had any luck recreating what I saw, and we decided to head back home before it was too cold and dark. As we changed course yet again and headed toward home, I realized that we had ended up right at the edge of my neighborhood, where suburbia meets the swamps of the southern United States, which, trust me, is a terrifying place to find yourself. Glad I had caught myself and my dog in time. We wheeled around toward home, and I realized I must have been going at a much faster pace if I had gotten all the way to the swamplands in just a few minutes. As I'm putting the key in my front door, my dog splayed out at my feet, tired from exertion. I saw it again. It was subtle, and not as far as it previously was. but that darker than darkness shadow returned to my vision. This time, though, it didn't seem like a blob. It was elongated, stretched vertically, almost an oblong oval in shape. I immediately turned in the direction of the shape, flipping my body to the right, and yet again, my left eye could pick nothing up with my real vision. This time, though, the shape didn't move or disappear. I was faced completely in front of this shape, looking at the utter darkness with my right eye, and searching frantically with my left eye and my intact vision, begging my eye to focus on what I so desperately needed to see. But there was nothing there. My left eye could pick up on absolutely nothing that fit the same size and shape as what my right eye was seeing. I stayed there a bit longer, thinking that maybe if my left eye couldn't pick up on whatever this was, my right eye could focus a bit. I squinted out of exertion, and begged my sight to return to me, so that I could finally live how I used to. The sight didn't come to me, but the shape did. Ever so slightly, it seemed to be getting larger. After what seemed like forever, the shape of complete darkness seemed to be within my physical touch parameters. I reached my arms out slowly, still searching with my left eye for something that I could physically see, some sort of idea or picture that I could quantify with my mind, but over and over again, I focused in on my right eye and had to realize that there was nothing physically there. Whatever I'm looking at, and whatever is coming toward me, doesn't exist. I continued reaching, straining my fingers toward this completely consuming darkness until I finally felt a cool sensation breach the top of my fingertips. It wasn't much, just a subtle, tangible change in temperature. Immediately after registering that I am actually touching what seems to not even be there, the shadow rushed me all at once, knocking me over onto my back. As I laid there, catching my breath that had been knocked out of my lungs, I searched desperately in my right eye to see something, anything, again. I sat up, reaching out in front of me in all directions, with fingers outstretched, hoping to feel anything, see anything, notice absolutely anything coming from my right eye. There was nothing there, and after a few minutes of frustrated tears rolling down my face with the realization that I wasn't actually getting my stolen eyesight back, I continued inside and didn't see any other shadows in my eye for the remainder of the evening. I continued my day as usual, and tucked into bed around 10 p.m., preparing to go to sleep early for my cornea repair surgery in the morning. I fell asleep easily, forgetting the strange events of the day, and slept soundly. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly to the low but consistent sound of my dog growling. Sometimes my neighbors make sudden noises in the middle of the night, so this isn't an uncommon occurrence. I didn't even open my eyes, just nudged him with my foot and cozied back into my bedding. He stopped growling temporarily, shocked into silence by my rebuttal, but about a minute later, the growling started up again, louder and more insistent than it was before. Thinking it was time for me to distract him and get him back to sleep, I sat up and opened my eyes, feeling in the darkness for the softness I recognize. Immediately, my left eye adjusts to what little light there is, taking the room in all of its black and white glory. Noticing that everything is just as I left it when I fell asleep. My right eye, however, didn't need to do any adjusting since the blackness is all I ever saw. I did notice, though, that sporadically placed in a circle around what would be my bed were 5 distinct, oblong shapes, stretched vertically. I immediately backed myself up into the headboard, grabbed my knees, and sat wondering how this was even possible. I had chalked my previous experience with this darker-than-dark shadow up to paranoia and anxiety leading up to the surgery, and had accepted it for what it was. Nothing. Apparently, though, my brain was not ready to forget that previous encounter, and spread all around me were duplicates of the exact shape. Or as much as I don't want to say it, entity. I reached blindly to my nightstand and flicked the lights on, hoping that the lights would vanish any shadows of the dark in both my room and standing around my bed. But as the lights flickered into life, the unbelievably dark figures were still poised around my bed but only visible in my right eye. I sat on my bed, heart in my throat, feeling each and every thump of blood rushing through my body, paralyzed by fear, and they started to move toward me, wasn't all at once. It just started as the one closest to my right, inching toward me. They all then shifted toward me, careful to avoid what would be the bed. If I had normal eyesight in that eye. Every couple of seconds they inched toward me, until the one on the right was within inches of my face. I could feel the chill emanating off the shadow just barely reaching my face, inspiring goosebumps up and down my arms. In a last-ditch effort of bravery, I turned to directly face whatever this was head-on, and as I turned, I felt the coldness envelop my body. The complete and utter darkness spread across not only my bad eye, but also my left eye, leaving me completely blind and sitting alone. I could no longer see the shadows around me, but I felt the chill that I had felt on my fingertips earlier that afternoon, spreading throughout my body. It started in my chest, pulsing outwards toward a farther extremity with each of my heartbeats. Finally, my entire body was cold from the inside out. The chill had gotten totally through my body, and I don't remember anything after that. I know I must have fallen asleep, and I must have gotten up, attended my surgery, gotten home, because when I finally snapped back into my consciousness, my eye was bandaged and I had a sheet of aftercare instructions to follow. I have no idea what happened, but I still can't see out of my right eye since it's currently bandaged and swollen. I'm afraid they're going to come back. I don't know what I did in my blackout period, how that even happened, or what those things are. I just know. I hope I get my vision back in both eyes. I think my husband is cheating on me. It started a couple of months ago. At first, it was the late nights, the way he seemed more irritated, and the constant showers. But the definitive one is when he wouldn't lend me his phone. We've always had an open communication, never hiding phones from one another. Hell, his phone is always unlocked. I didn't mind it until I saw his phone lying on the table, and I tried calling my mom through his phone, but it was locked. It was at this time that I knew something was going on. He has been out on late nights before, and being a software engineer is not an easy task, but this was different. He never locks his phone. I didn't confront him at first. It might have just been my imagination, but once suspicions are seated, they never leave. As the days continued, the gnawing in the back of my mind continued. I looked for other signs, perfume on his clothes, lipstick, or any sort of marks, but nothing. There was nothing. The only thing I could smell in his clothes was a chemical smell, which was understandable as he was contracted to work in a medical lab of some sort. I finally asked him the question, "Why is your phone locked?" I said, "My phone's locked?" He responded, almost surprised by the question, "Yeah, you never have it locked when you're home." "Oh, I don't know. I didn't think much of it. I guess I changed the settings when we were looking at this new project for the bosses." But you never have it locked when you are home," I responded, suspicious of him. "I know, honey, but the bosses really wanted things tight-knit. They were anal about me already having the phone in the office, but I explained to them that I needed it for different tasks. They only agreed so long as I don't always use it in the office and keep it locked." "Why? Does it bug you?" "No, it doesn't," I said with a distinct tone. He then flashed a devil grin that made me fall in love with him all those years ago. "Is someone mad they're not getting enough attention?" he asked teasingly. He then grabbed me from behind and hugged me tightly, like when we were kids in high school. He then kissed me on the cheek and left. That should have been the end of it, but the distance only grew. I couldn't handle it anymore. The final straw was an engagement in which I just asked him how was work. "It's fucking work, Linda. What do you expect it to be like? Fucking roller coasters and cotton candy?" He snapped. He then packed his work briefcase and sped off into the night. I sat there, shocked at his response. He's never so much as sworn on his worst day. He's usually sweet and innocent. Hell, I've been in more fights than he has. This only elated my curiosity, and I did what every jealous wife does. Looked up his location. showed him a couple of streets away, and I know I should not follow him, but the fact was that he has never so much as raised his voice at me. Not even a hitch. I grabbed my coat and headed for my SUV. I'm not a professional when it comes to following people. I know to stay behind a few cars, but I was afraid I'd lose track of him. I got honked at a few times, and it should have been enough for my husband to notice, but he didn't. He continued to his destination. Before I knew it, we were near some sort of medical facility, his workplace. I knew it. I had been acting crazy this whole time. Why would he suddenly cheat on me? The marriage hadn't gotten boring and we were still all over each other. Until recently. Once he got to this new location, a few weeks after we got here is when the mood changed. Was it someone from work then? Or was it really just stress? Seeing him walk in the front doors, I proceeded to follow him inside, hoping to apologize to him. Of course, there was no other woman. I dismissed all crazy notions I had before of my husband, suspecting that I was just missing him all this time he had been away from me to be at work. Just crazy woman hormones, I guess. I chuckled to myself. I went inside and followed from a distance in the hallways. Most of the staff were gone due to the weekend, and security let me in through the front, recognizing me from the pictures in my husband's office. I caught a few glimpses of him around each hallway, and he wasn't heading to his office. Each turn took me to a completely different area of the facility in which he worked nowhere near. My unease grew with each echo of his footstep, each hallway growing darker, gloomier than the last one. We were heading to a completely disclosed area of the facility. Words like biohazard, caution, and danger were thrown in every direction. The echo of his footsteps suddenly stopped after I heard a heavy door shut. I saw a door swinging on its hinges, the sort they use at big, refrigerated areas. Greg worked nowhere near here. I had been to his office and this was nowhere near it. As I reached to open the next set of doors placed in my way, I heard talking on the other side of the door. Greg's voice. Only his. He kept pausing as if hearing a response, but I heard nothing from the other end. We can't be doing this all the time. I think Linda is starting to suspect something. No, I don't think she will do anything, but I just don't want this to end. I love what we have too, but we'll have to break it off, just for a bit. I knew you'd understand. I'll see you once everything has settled. There was a long pause before the footsteps started getting louder and coming back towards the door. I quickly hid behind one of the swinging doors, careful he wouldn't see me. I didn't want to confront him yet because I honestly didn't know what the hell was going on. It sounded like an affair with a non-existent person. Greg didn't even notice me as he left in a hurry. As soon as he was out of sight, I quickly entered the room. It was a large, open area with a chilling atmosphere. Tiles of white covered the entire floor, and on each side were square metal doors, it seemed, all stacked on each other. It was a morgue. One slab lay in the middle of it all, covered in a sheet. I uncovered it, revealing a dissected body of a woman. Organs were displayed in the open. I almost threw up immediately after the revelation. It all came crashing down, and the reality of it all was too much. I quickly covered the sheet and stood there, horrified at the truth of it all. My husband was completely insane. From beneath the sheets, a low and guttural moan escaped the sheet. Asking a girl out for the first time on Valentine's Day can sometimes be a gamble. Should I ask her to go out sometime before Valentine's Day first? Is asking someone out for a first date on Valentine's Day too presumptuous? Should Valentine's Day be reserved for couples who have already reached a certain point in their relationship? And if V-Day is reserved for pre-existing relationships, would she reject my Valentine's Day invitation despite her willingness to say yes on any other day? Also, will that permanently seal me under the category of friend? I wrestled with this idea for 24 hours before finally deciding to say, screw it. What have I got to lose other than my dignity? And so, with my newfound bravery, I decided to text her. Very brave of me, right? It went something like this. Me. What are you doing? Her. Nothing. You? Me. Trying to make a decision. Her. A decision? About what? Me. Where we should go this Friday? Are you asking me out for Valentine's Day? Maybe. Where would you take me? It's a surprise. Are you saying yes? Maybe. Then she put a winky face. Little did she know, it wasn't just going to be a surprise for her. In reality, I had no idea where I was going to take her. But that little chocolate-covered lie bought me a bit of time to find a place to go. I started Googling Valentine's Day events in town. I came up with the usual restaurants, inviting couples for their special V-Day dinners, dance club parties, etc. Then I saw something that stuck out, an event for a Valentine's Day festival on a meetup group website. That's different, I thought. I've never heard of a festival for V-Day. It says they'll have food, drinks, dancing, and entertainment of many types. I decided that this was the winner and signed us up for their RSVP form. That Friday came quickly. I picked her up around 7 and we drove out to the event, which was a bit outside of town. It was about a 45-minute drive past a lot of fields and barren areas. When we finally reached the destination on Google Maps, I saw a sign hung at the corner of a small turnoff that read Valentine's Festival, with an arrow pointing down the dirt drive. We pulled in, and after a few seconds of nothing but trees and brush, we saw some other vehicles parked in an improvised parking lot fashion on the lawn. This brought a sigh of relief, as I really didn't want to look like a complete idiot in front of her on our first date, especially with it being Valentine's Day. We parked, got out. I took her arm in arm as we walked toward what looked like a large outdoor party going on with lots of lanterns and merry-sounding noise. This was definitely the place. I looked at her and noticed a smile. "This looks like fun," she said. I smiled when I saw that she was happy with my decision. We eventually came to a front gate where a woman, dressed in period clothing, asked to see our RSVPs. I showed her on my phone, and she checked off our names on a sheet. We continued inward. To put it lightly, this place was beautiful. There were colored lantern lights everywhere, soft white string lights defining sections and walkways, an incredible food spread, which was, as of yet, untouched. People dancing, singing, and even some old men dressed in religious wear who seemed to be just as into it as everyone else. Most of them were dressed in the same period clothing as the woman who checked our RSVPs at the gate. And it was all set up in a field with beautiful flowers and greenery all around us. It looked perfect. I was proud of myself for making this decision. She would definitely be impressed. A minute later, we were approached by an older woman who looked happy to see us. "Hello, you must be our guests," she said with a smile. "We are definitely two of them," I said. She laughed. "Come with me. We'll get you all set up for the festival. It starts shortly." "Okay," I said, looking at my date. We smiled at each other and started following the woman. She led us to an area with some small wooden booths. I wasn't sure if these were outhouses, phone booths, or what. She said, "You take the one on the left, she can take the one on the right. Inside, you will find clothing to change into." "We have to change clothing?" I asked. "Yes, for the aesthetic of the festival. You're both going to look so cute." I looked at my date, gave her a half smirk with a shoulder shrug, and she did the same back. We entered our booths. I felt kind of silly wearing this costume clothing, but I was going to play along if everybody else was. I exited the booth. She was still in hers. A couple of minutes later, she opened the door and stepped out slowly, wearing a stunning dress of many colors. She looked like a princess. I think she could tell by my widened eyes that I liked it. "See something you like?" she asked. I chuckled. "Absolutely." The woman looked at us both with a satisfied smile. "You both look splendid. We'll keep your clothing in bags for you. Come along." We followed her. She led us to an area with several tables of food and drink and told us to make ourselves at home. We grabbed some small plates of hors d'oeuvres, along with some wine. We talked and ate. "How did you find this place?" she asked. "I found it online. Do you like it?" "Of course I do. It's wonderful." After finishing our food, we refilled our wine and headed out toward an area where there were people laughing and dancing to music played by a small group of musicians with stringed instruments. I asked her to dance, and we danced, and laughed, and even kissed. A little while later, everybody started moving to another location, so we followed. We came to an area with a large platform, like a stage with 2 chairs in the middle. The stage was decorated with flowers of red, yellow, and orange. Shortly after, a few of those old men in religious garb walked up to the steps on the side of the stage, bringing a couple of guests with them, and directing them to sit in the chairs. I couldn't wait to see what they were about to do. After the guests in the chairs, a male and a female, were seated, the woman who had given us our festival clothing approached the stage, then turned to address the crowd. "As we are here to honor the great Romulus and Remus, creators of Rome, the festival has now begun." Everyone began cheering. "Who?" I whispered to my date. "Shh," she said. "Bring her in," said the woman. A large carriage was being pulled by several men toward the stage. When they got closer and people were out of the way, I noticed that there was some sort of animal inside. A very large animal. When the carriage reached the front of the stage, it became clear to me that this was some sort of wolf-like creature. I was getting pretty uneasy by this point. The woman turned toward the guests on stage. "For this part, you will be the goats," she said, pointing at the man. He laughed. She then turned to the female and said, "And you will be the dog." She looked confused and insulted by this statement. The male said, "What?" The woman assured him, "Don't worry, it's part of the celebration." And he seemed to calm down, but still looked annoyed. I looked at my date and whispered, "This is getting weird." She replied, "Yeah." Both guests were starting to look woozy, like they were about to pass out. The female guest's wine goblet fell to the floor with a loud clanking sound as she slumped over. The male looked over at her, frightened and angry. "What are you doing?" he exclaimed, then looking at his own wine goblet just before passing out. The old men in religious garb started strapping them both into their chairs. I shouted, "What the hell's going on here?" as my date grabbed my arm. The woman placed her hand on my arm, saying, "It's okay. It's okay. This is normal." I looked at her with confusion. The wolf-like creature in the carriage cage was getting upset by my outburst and was growling toward me. Back on the stage, the old men in religious garb started stripping their clothes off until they were completely naked. "What the hell is this?" I exclaimed. 2 of the naked old men picked up large knives and walked in front of the couple in the chairs. Before I knew what was happening, the old religious men thrust the knives into the couple's chest simultaneously, pulled them out, turned toward the crowd and wiped the bloody blades across their foreheads. They then started laughing and the crowd cheered. "Oh my God," I exclaimed, grabbing my date's arm. "We have to get out of here." She looked at me in horror, with tears coming from her eyes. "Don't be frightened," said the woman. "This is all part of the celebration." The wolf creature was getting angrier and louder, still looking in my direction. I screamed, "Let's go," at my date. At this point, the woman shouted, "Let her out," as several men started opening the cage door to the carriage to let the wolf free. We ran, hand in hand, back in the direction that we came from. I plowed through people as we ran back toward the entrance gate. We got through the gate and I slammed it shut. We continued running toward the parking lot. The funny part is, when I looked back, nothing was chasing after us. It was like they didn't think there was anything wrong. When we got to the car, I first unlocked her door to make sure she was safe inside, then unlocked mine and jumped in. And unlike every horror movie I've ever seen, the car started on the first try. We sped away, leaving a dirt cloud in our wake. After a couple of minutes, I finally glanced over and my date was looking tired. She was passing out. Oh no, I thought. We drank the wine. A few minutes later, I started feeling like I was about to pass out. Then I decided that we had a better chance of making it if I pulled over than if I passed out and crashed. So I pulled over and dialed 911. At least, I think I did. I don't remember hanging up. I don't even remember talking to them. All I remember is being awoken by police busting out my window. EMS was on the scene and pulled us both out of the car, loading us into the back of an ambulance. That's the last thing I remember before the next day. When we woke in a hospital the next morning, I learned that our stomachs had been pumped as a preventative measure, as they didn't know what was in the wine that we drank. They had us on IVs all night to keep us hydrated. I told the police all about the festival, the murders, everything. I even gave them the address of the event that I punched into Google Maps the prior evening. Later that day, I received a call from them saying that they checked the address, but there was nothing there. I told them, I know it's in the middle of nowhere, but it was down a dirt side drive to the left, right by where Google said the address should be. You have to go through the drive and everything is back there in the field. The officer hesitated for a few seconds, then replied, We did see the side drive, and we did go through it. There's nothing back there. No people, no lights, no stages, no garbage left behind, nothing. We spent over an hour looking. There's just nothing there. I then grabbed my phone to bring up the festival group of the meetup website. As you guessed it, gone. I hope I'm wrong, but something seems seriously wrong with the local coyotes. I couldn't sleep the other night, so I decided to go on a late night drive. For context, I live in a very rural western state, and it's not uncommon for towns to be hours apart from each other. I decided to head towards the abandoned nuclear site that's about 2 hours out of my town. It's a nice quiet drive, and you can drive out into the hills and see the stars in a way that isn't possible even in a small town. The drive started normally enough. It was calm and quiet, pretty much exactly what I wanted to calm my mind and tire me out. About 30 miles out of town, my radio started making strange noises. I had kept the volume low just because I was enjoying the quiet, but suddenly a roar of static and voices filled my cab. Now, I drive an older truck, so things randomly going haywire isn't totally unusual, but I've never really heard of a radio suddenly gaining a life of its own and screaming to the world. The sudden blast of noise scared me, causing me to jerk the steering wheel. As I slid to the side of the road, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. There was a large figure off to the left-hand side of my truck. As my truck got closer, everything seemed to go in slow motion. The monstrous figure arched its back, letting out a scream unlike anything I had ever heard before. Its legs were almost stilt-like, thin and tall, while gangly arms swung like pendulums as it bellowed again. What I assume were its eyes flashed a piercing white as it craned its head towards me. I gripped the steering wheel even tighter as my truck veered into the borrow pit I had failed to see earlier in the dark. As if my luck could not get any worse, as I closed my eyes, I realized that the monster before me had been standing in the pit. I closed my eyes and waited for the crunching of my truck's grill as its shadow loomed over me. I sat there, bracing for the sound of crunching metal to echo through the empty roadway. But it never came. Once the gravel quieted under my wheels, I opened my eyes. The ditch before me laid empty. There was no sign of the monstrosity I had seen just a few moments before. The truck was still running, and everything seemed fine. I just started to relax and question my sanity when pained yipping slowly sounded from underneath my truck. I gathered what shaking resolve I had left, along with a tire iron, and slowly got out of my truck. Using my phone as a flashlight, I carefully looked under my truck. 2 white orbs peered back at me as I moved the light under the cab. I dropped my phone and jumped back as the pained cries intensified. I stood there, with my tire iron raised, waiting for whatever monster it was to crawl out and attack me. I stood there for what seemed like ages as the cries slowly quieted down. As I was grabbing my phone, I heard a small and very weak cough coming from under my truck. Feeling brave, I once again decided to look under the truck, and to my surprise, staring back at me was a small coyote pup. His eyes glimmered white as he turned to look at my light. My heart sank as I saw him cough weakly and try to stand, but to no avail. I don't know what came over me, but impulsively, I climbed in the cab of my truck and grabbed an old t-shirt from the floorboards. Without hesitation, I found myself crawling under the truck and through the sagebrush and gravel to save a tiny coyote who just minutes earlier managed to scare the ever-living shit out of me. The tiny creature stared at me, half terrified as I reached for him. He let out one last ear-piercing shriek as I set the shirt on him and pulled him out. He was alert, but his body felt limp in my limbs. Terrified that I had broken his back, I quickly searched the nearest wildlife vet on my phone. I set the coyote on the floor of the cab as I looked at the options. There was a vet about 2 hours away that specialized in wildlife care, but with a little more scrolling, I realized there was a vet even closer. The search said it would be 4 hours away taking the main roads, but having grown up in this area, I knew there was a shortcut through the old nuclear site. The roads had been long abandoned, but they were drivable, especially in an old four-wheel drive. I looked down at the coyote as I climbed back into the driver's seat, and for a split second I wondered if this really was what I saw on the road. As another weak cough escaped its lips, I threw the truck in drive without a second thought. As the truck climbed out of the borrow pit, I noticed hundreds of white eyes watching us. Every time the truck moved and the light of the headlights shifted, it was as though new eyes just appeared. I've never known coyotes to be true pack animals, but I guess caring for the wounded is a cross-species experience. My engine roared as we neared the site, and my new furry friend laid quiet as I scanned the roadside for the dirt trail that would lead us to our destination. The wind echoed through the abandoned buildings on either side of us as we sped through. Every now and then in the window I would catch the reflection of what looked to be a set of glowing eyes, but I reassured myself it was just my headlights. I could see the turnoff getting closer, and we nearly missed it as a bellowing screech echoed off the crumbling buildings. I hit the gas as I glanced in the rearview mirror. Behind us stood another one of the grotesque creatures I had seen earlier. A spindly arm reached out and grabbed the tailgate of the truck, ripping it off of its hinges. I took the turn far too fast, and the tiny coyote and I went bumbling through the brush and rocks off the trail. Fearing the creature was still behind us, I did my best to correct our course and get us back to the dirt road, but in the chaos I managed to lose all sense of direction. I could see the outline of the buildings behind us and the open range in front of us. The nuclear site was huge, and without getting closer, there was no way to tell where we actually were. No longer seeing any sign of the monster, I decided to stop the truck and get my bearings. If we tried to backtrack, we could have ended up right back in that creature's clutches. If we continued forward, we had the option of being lost in the desert and probably dying out there. I tried to decide what to do when I heard a strange popping coming from the passenger side of the truck. I flinched as I realized how hard the ride had to have been for the coyote. There's no way that off-roading was any sort of comfortable for him in the shape he was in. The strange popping noise happened again, and I looked down at my new friend. I was horrified as I watched his tiny body writhe and pop. The joints that were once limp seemed to snap into place, and it looked as though they were elongating as I stared in abject horror. I didn't have any time to process what was happening because demonic howls and white eyes seemed to surround the truck. Without a second thought, I threw the truck into gear and barreled deeper into the desert, driving in no particular direction other than away. I noticed fur suddenly filling my passenger seat. A deep grumbling whine filled the cab. By the time I looked back up, a boulder had filled the once empty space in front of the truck. I turned the wheel as hard as I could, somehow managing to avoid colliding head-on with the boulder, but still managing to lose my driver's side mirror in the process. Knowing we were heading right back into the thick of the creatures, I slammed down on the gas. If they were going to get me, I wasn't going to go down without a fight. Slamming through sagebrush and rocks, I was shocked by the vast emptiness. There wasn't a single monster in sight. Instinctively, I drove in the direction I expected the road to be. The desert seemed silent, but for the hammering of my engine. By the time my tires hit the ruts of the dirt road, I had almost forgotten about the coyote riding with me. As I got back on the path, I slowed down to check on it. Not only had I hit a coyote, I just put him through a whirlwind of a truck ride that may or may not have been caused by a wild hallucination on my part. I pulled the truck to a stop as I saw the familiar decrepit buildings alongside the roadside and looked down to them. When I did, I was shocked by what was on the floorboards. Fur everywhere, and long limbs bent at unnatural angles. As my gaze wandered up, the radio roared to life once again, scaring me so badly I hit the gas almost instinctively. Without realizing what I had done, I looked up and saw two wild white eyes staring, and a large maw filled with saber-like teeth right in my face. As I screamed, it let out a hellish howl, loud enough to crack my windshield. I jerked the wheel and we managed to collide with a large cement building. My face slammed into the steering wheel as we crashed through the cement outer walls of the building. I could hear the creature's screeches as the truck continued on course, finally ending its journey when we slammed into a large metal box. I started drifting in and out of consciousness. The sound of the engine hummed on as I watched more of these monsters tearing the passenger door off. They bellowed as they dragged their companion out of the truck. When I awoke next, I was in a hospital room. There were police and doctors standing around me, covered in lead panels and protective equipment. It was then that I learned at least part of the truth surrounding the site. The locals had always been told that the site was abandoned because of a lack of funding. According to the officer who was questioning me, that wasn't at all true. That nuclear site was the site of one of America's first nuclear meltdowns. Its only true nuclear disaster. I guess back in the 60s they were doing experiments with breeder reactors. Someone made a mistake and the control rod was pulled too far out, throwing the reactor into a full meltdown. Several people were killed, but given the nature of the experiment, the government quickly jumped in and started a cover-up. Their actions would later inspire how the Soviets addressed the Chernobyl meltdown. The reactor was quickly encased in a lead coffin and had a nondescript concrete building erected around it. The rest of the site was quickly abandoned, but was still monitored, which is, I guess, how they found me. No one can explain the coyote monsters I met with. The cops keep accusing me of trespassing in the buildings. They say I have radiation poisoning and that caused wild hallucinations, but I know I didn't have contact with any of the buildings until I was faced with that creature in my truck. I managed to damage the lead coffin, exposing myself to radiation levels our hospital has never seen before. I'm so very tired, but I felt like I had to write this down. It wouldn't shock me if this post disappears after I die, or the government decides to cover it up. But I couldn't leave what happened to me unsaid. Don't trust coyotes and never go near anything the government has abandoned. Hurry up, I thought you knew what you were doing. The words were hissed from over my shoulder as I fiddled with the lockpick. I'd left my gloves at home and my hands were shaking from the cold. Just give me a minute, I said. Danny was shaking too, in her short skirts and thin faux leather jacket. She rocked back and forth on her feet to stave off the early winter chill. I could feel her eyes burning holes in the back of my head. Hey jackass, over here. Parker didn't even try to keep it down as he poked his head around the corner, cigarette dangling from his fingertips like its own appendage. His grin was charming despite the chipped front tooth and nicotine stains. He nodded to his right. Windows open. Danny shot a pointed glance my way as I pushed off the ground and swiped at the dirt on my knees. Her heels sunk into the ground as she stormed off around the corner. Followed close behind her. Daring a look at the neighbor's darkened house beside us. There wasn't so much as a peep on the rest of the street, but off in the distance, I could see stadium lights blaring. There was a familiar symphony of hoots and hollers that was the soundtrack to every fall Friday night in this particular corner of hell. We'd have another hour and a half at least. By the time we made it to Parker, he'd already had the window jammed up and was halfway inside of it. He hit the carpet with a thud and in a blink was out of sight. I gave Danny a boost and crawled in after her. Parker's phone was already in his hand, and he used it as a flashlight to illuminate the cluttered dining room we landed in. Shadows danced across the ornate carpet and off-white walls, the glare from the lights obscuring the dozens of picture frames placed strategically around the room. A distinct must filled the air, sharp and punctuated by the acrid smell of cigarette smoke. Parker snuffed his butt out on the polished hardwood table in front of us. Danny crossed her arms in front of her chest. Okay, where is it then? Parker grinned and slapped his hand down on her shoulder. That's what we're here to find out. Danny's gaze was skeptical as she turned back to look at me, and Parker. Well, he was already off and wandering down the hall. Just keep an eye out, I said. It won't take long. My overly eager companion had headed off for the bedrooms, and so I went in the opposite direction, slipping off into the kitchen instead. It was a small, familiar house, and there were only so many places to search. I wasn't quite prepared for the wave of nostalgia that washed over me as I tugged the first cabinet open and was greeted by rows of delicate mugs and half-sized drinking glasses. Everything was exactly in the place I'd left it 6 years ago, when I used to mow the lawn for Mrs. Higgins after her husband's stroke left him incapable of doing so. Every time she'd insist on ushering me into the kitchen afterwards and pouring me a big glass of lemonade, I'd sit on their scratchy brown couch and chug it down, eager to get it over with and escape Mr. Higgins' silent stare from the armchair in the corner. I shut the cabinet and moved to the next. And then the next after that. There was nothing that seemed out of the norm, or like it had the makings of a good hiding spot. Soon, I moved on to the pantry. Things were a bit more cluttered there, pots and pans stacked up, boxes of non-perishables pulled down off the top shelf and stuffed into the middle two racks, threatening to spill over. The last few years of living on her own must have taken their toll on the old widow. Though a sour sort of guilt swam noticeably in my stomach, I also felt thankful her family had finally convinced her it was time to give up the ghost. Prairie Dreams Assisted Living was just a 2-minute drive away, and surely she was much safer there than she was in this house all alone, particularly at the moment. They hadn't been as much of a hurry to get the house sold and cleaned out though, and if Mrs. Higgins' lush of a few great-nephew was anything to go by, there was still plenty worth having hidden away somewhere inside. Not in the pantry though. I slipped back into the kitchen and headed off down the hall, ignoring Danny's foot tapping impatiently against the carpet. There were 4 doors down the length of the hall, one to the right, one straight ahead, and 2 farther down to the left. I didn't have to wonder where Parker had headed off to, as I heard a crash resounding from the back bedroom as I made my approach. Parker was on the floor when I made my way inside, using both hands to gather up the jewels and gems scattered out from a hardwood jewelry box on the floor. My heart sank as he scooped a pearl necklace up and into his pocket. It was the same necklace Mrs. Higgins had worn to her husband's funeral. She looked so frail that day, like a paper doll. When they'd lowered him into the ground, she'd crumpled right into herself, and Danny swore she could hear the poor widow wailing all the way from school. That was the deciding factor to get her moved away finally. The screaming. Every night the sound echoed down our quiet little streets, floated in through the windows. She'd been making quite a stir around town these last few months. It was always a sad thing when dementia took its hold. Not that one, I said from the doorway. Parker laughed and shook his head. Whatever you say, boss. We can't spend all night just looking. Didn't Trent say anything about where it could be? Like they'd tell that idiot shit. He just found the will on his mama's desk. Overheard her saying they hadn't had time to move it all to the bank yet. Gotta be somewhere. He pushed himself up off the floor and fished another cigarette out of his pocket and turned back toward the hall. I couldn't imagine they'd stash their fortune in either of the guest bedrooms or in the living room of all places. I'd seen every inch of this house at some points or another, if just in flashes and peeks. There weren't any safes or desks, anything overly suspicious at all. It might as well have been my own grandma's house, neat and orderly, filled with afghans and quilts and embroidery. I hadn't believed it when I first heard they'd had a small fortune stashed away somewhere inside. But when Parker Googled what the old Higgins farm was worth nowadays... The basement, I said as the thought occurred to me, nodding for Parker to follow. I'd only seen the basement once or twice, when I came over with my own grandma a time or two when I was little. She'd trade her home-jarred jams for Mrs. Higgins' pickles. We always got enough to last us well until the next canning season. Hell, we probably still have a jar or two stashed away in the back of the cupboard somewhere. Danny huffed as we passed by again, falling in step behind Parker as we made our way to the small alcove just off the kitchen. This is the stupidest idea you guys have ever had, you know that? And that's saying something. I didn't pay her any mind as the door creaked open, and I stared down at the darkness swimming below. The chill that floated up the stairs made my neck hair stand to attention, and as Parker was busy ribbing Danny, I was busy working up the nerve to step down onto the first step. A burst of light made my eyes sting, like a firework exploding right in front of me. Shit, I said, jumping back, only to knock into Parker's chest and hear my girlfriend howl with laughter. Her hand was on a switch just to the side of the door. Hey, we said... It's just the stair light, genius. No one's gonna see. Get a move on. Parker patted my back and started down the stairs. Similarly to the rest of the house, the basement might as well have been untouched since I last left it, with everything still perfectly in place. Only the dust down here was thicker, more developed, clinging on to the uncovered couch and end tables like it was scared they were going to leave. The sharp smell only intensified, stinging my nose. It was reminiscent of an empty dumpster, or straight sewage. Dully, I heard something tapping in the distance. Click, click, click. I wondered if she developed a leak somewhere. It was a large basement, with a second living area and 3 doors branching off into a washroom, guest room, and storage space. The light from the stairwell illuminated everything else just a touch, but the way it made the shadows dart and dance just made the place all the more eerie. Are you sure it's down here? Danny whispered from behind me. Just go check the guest room, I said, and turned off toward the canning room. It was just how I'd remembered it. Dank and dark, colder than the rest of the basement by a good 10 degrees. It was the only unfinished room down there, lined with wooden shelves still stocked to the brim with preserved foods. There was a single light bulb perched above me with a simple pull chain to get it going. I gave it a tug and ran my fingers along the rows of chilled jars. My eyes started to adjust. There didn't seem to be much room to do any hiding in here, but something about the room got me excited again. It was close. I could feel it. If there was one thing I learned about old farmers from growing up in this shit little town, it was that they didn't put a lick of trust in the banks. Growing up in the Great Depression will do that to you, I guess. Somehow the irony of them sitting on small fortunes while the rest of the town rots away around them dulled my sympathy, however. I started tugging jars off of shelves, setting them down gently at first, and then with a clatter as my patience started to dissipate and my paranoia grew. Nothing under them, nothing behind them, just concrete walls on every side. I huffed and kicked a jar so hard it shattered against the wall. A screech filled the air, piercing right through the door I'd closed behind me and vibrating through what was left of the jars. It was a horrid sort of sound, high-pitched and yearning. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours of it running right through me, zipping through my veins like a live wire and turning them to ice. All at once I felt hollowed out, empty, alone. And then Parker started to scream. I tore back into the living area just in time to see Parker stumbling backward out of the washroom, tugging the door closed behind him. There's something. Someone, he stammered out, just as Danny darted around the darkened corner. What are you doing? Shut the fuck up. There's something there. Parker kept his grip firm on the doorknob, even as wild eyes darted between the two of us, even as his arms shook. A terrible sense of dread found its home in my belly as I took in the sight of him, scared shitless as he was, illuminated by the dull stairwell light shining down on him. Had Mrs. Higgins found her way out of her nursing home, found her way all the way back here? Was Mrs. Higgins and her screaming grief just right behind that door? We gotta go. I grabbed his elbow, tugging him back. They'll be looking for her. This will just be the first place they go. Another scream, accompanied this time by the sound of Danny's voice, high-pitched and yelping. I turned just in time to see her slip back through the doorway behind her. I dropped Parker's arm and bolted, nearly tripping over my own feet when his hand tangled in the back of my shirt, holding me firm. We have to. Danny. I struggled away from him and tumbled forward, disoriented by the darkness and deafening noise, but resolute nonetheless. There was something else mixed in there with the screams, something that just started to register as I took the corner and my hand shot out reflexively to grasp for the light switch. A sickening sort of crunch. I flipped the switch, and as the overhead fixtures kicked into life, that longing sort of howl came to a sudden end. Danny's scream still tore through the air, however, absorbing into it just like her blood did into the shag carpet beneath her. It was a terrible sight, so sudden my mind didn't quite know how to make sense of it. She was splayed out on her back, gulping for air like a fish. Her right arm was nearly torn in half, forearm hanging on by little bits of tendon and tissue, bone cut clean through. No, not cut. The edges on either side were jagged and rough, like a rusty saw had its way with it, like a dog had chewed right through. That wasn't the whole of it, though. Her left side was torn to pieces, like it had been put right through the shredder. I'd never seen so much blood in my life, not even at my uncle's pig farm during butchering season. For a minute, all I could do was stare. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. Parker's words cut through my stupor, and I felt a numb sort of shock that he'd stuck around with me. I dropped to my knees at Danny's side, grabbing a quilt from the bed and pressing down over her stomach, before thinking better of it and trying to wrap half of it around her arm. It's gonna be okay, I said. Or at least I think I did. I think I said a lot of things, but all I could hear was the wind rushing past my ears, carrying her sobs like a wave crashing against the shore. We're going to get you help. We gotta go, Parker said from behind me, over and over again like a prayer. I snapped at him to call 911, any fear of being caught or going to jail suddenly unimportant as I held my girlfriend's dying body in my arms. Parker patted his pockets, frantic and shaking. I dropped it. I must have dropped it. Go get it. My shouts left him stumbling back, bracing against the doorway as he turned around. His footsteps faltered almost instantly as he peered back into the living space, and just above Danny's pain croaking, I could hear it again. Click, click, click. Matt? Parker whispered, frozen in place. Matt, what the hell is... Another scream tore through the air like an arrow. I jumped to my feet just as Parker fell backward, landing with a thunk on his ass on the bedroom floor. I stayed fixed by Danny's side, even as my friend started to kick and scramble backward like a crab. The scream grew closer, deafening. For a moment, all I could see was darkness waiting beyond the door frame, and then all at once my sense of reality shattered before me. It hit the doorway like a bug splatters against the windshield with a violent, explosive force. My mind couldn't make sense of it at first, and so it took it in bits and pieces. Its skin was gray and mottled, like a piece of beef left out to rot. Its arms, if you'd call them arms, gripped the edges of the door frame, clinging on with the four sharp talons that sat on the edge of each appendage. Some semblance of clothes hung off its skeletal frame, loose and torn, jostling over its body. Nothing, however, compared to the creature's head. Upon first glance, it looked vaguely humanoid, with a mouth and nose, and dips in the front of its skull where eyes should have been. Only an oozing black liquid filled the sockets instead, bubbling out and over its pronounced cheekbones. Cloth wrappings were wound around its face, pushed up on its forehead and sloping over its nose. They were in shreds as well, after what appeared to be a forceful attempt to remove them. And its mouth. Oh God, its mouth. I tucked my arms under Danny's shoulders and started to drag her backward toward the bed. The creature snapped its gaping maw shut once and twice in warning, displaying elongated and wicked teeth. Parker kept crawling backwards, and I prepared myself for the worst as I dragged Danny around the corner and covered her body with my own. Only it never came. The screaming died for a long moment, and Parker's heavy breathing from the other side of the mattress eventually clued me into the fact that he was still alive. When I dared to glance back up at the creature, it was gone, and my friend sat in a puddle of his own piss. I couldn't blame him. Danny's noises had faded into a shallow, keening sort of whimper. I lowered her shoulders gently to the ground and pulled my legs out from underneath her. My jeans were already stiff with her blood, and they protested as I slowly found my footing. Click, click, click. It wasn't the sound of dripping at all. Less rhythmic, less organic. It sounded more like someone was clicking their tongue repeatedly, or like a lizard snapping its jaw shut. It pulled me forward like a moth to a flame, though the few wits I had left kept me from passing the threshold into the main area of the basement. There, on the opposite wall it stood, arms outstretched and groping at the cheap imitation panel. I might not have seen it at all, had its bandages not caught the dull glow of the still illuminating stairwell. Its head rotated with spasming jerks, rolling atop its shoulder, until those gooey gaping holes were pointed right at me. Click, click, click. I sucked in my breath automatically, my whole body freezing up like a stalled Chevy. But the creature stayed planted, and after a terrible eternal moment, it carried on against the wall. I turned back and fell to Parker's side, gripping his collar as his jaw slacked open. I jammed a finger against my lips to shush him. His usual bravado was soaked into his pants, and the terrified thing that was buried underneath of it wasn't something that I recognized. I don't think it can see us. I whispered, cupping my lips against his ear. Or come in the light. We have to be quiet. Parker didn't respond until I grabbed his collar again and gave it a shake, at which point he gave one short nod. Finding my feet was harder this time, though as Parker reached up to grab my forearm, I did my best to steel myself. I didn't hear Danny anymore, but something in me kept me from assuming the worst. I knew we wouldn't be able to get her out of there, not if we had to leave quickly and quietly. But in the glow of the ceiling lights, at least she'd be safe. Safe until we could get her some help. The creature had moved quite a bit by the time we made our way back to the doorway, now roaming near the couch on the far side of the room perpendicular to us. Only it wasn't on its feet any longer. Instead, perched several feet up on the wall itself, claws crunching and crushing as it went. Parker dropped my arm and started to stumble back. I grabbed him once more, nodding toward the way we came. After one last moment of hesitation, I dipped my foot back out into the darkness. Click, click, click. It didn't seem to notice, and my relief was instantaneous. One footstep, 2, 3. I kept my eyes peeled on it even as I moved forward, watching as it slowly roamed and tutted across the room. Its thick, unpleasant odor nearly made me gag. Parker overtook me, dropping my arm as he darted forward. The sound of his sneakers slapping against the carpet was reminiscent to the tinny clang of a snare drum, echoing back and forth along the claustrophobic walls. My chest felt suddenly tight, as if my rib cage had wrapped itself right around my racing heart, squeezing tight until it threatened to burst. The creature roared again, and I fell to my knees, arms wrapping hopelessly over the top of my head for some meager form of protection. I felt a rush of wind gush past me, but when the inevitable crash of claws and fangs didn't arrive, I dared to open my eyes and peek ahead. Parker had made it to the stairs in their protective glow, collapsing at the top step as he pulled in greedy lungfuls of air. He didn't even look back at me. The fucker. Just left me there to die. My mind had hardly registered as one screech ended and another began, too numb with fear and anger to make sense of what was happening. Yellow-white claws glinted off the light from the stairwell as they wrapped around Parker's elbow, dipped just over the landing. He was flung forward effortlessly, crashing into the opposite wall with a yelp. Another sound joined the fray, something reminiscent of a chicken's neck being snapped in half before the plucking. For all his faults, I'd like to say I stayed and watched what fate befell my best friend. I'd like to say I did something to stop it. I didn't, though. Instead, I got up and I ran straight into the storage room in front of the stairs where the damn thing had come from in the first place. I flipped on the lights and shoved the washing machine in front of the door, then promptly collapsed into a puddle of sweat and tears, and my own grief-stricken wallows. There were a few thin windows in this room, too small for me to climb out of myself, but Some distant part of me hoped that someone might hear my cries and come to my rescue. They didn't. I stayed there the rest of the night, listening to the creature click and slurp and traverse the walls and ceiling. Eventually my breathing slowed, and my hand stilled to a barely noticeable tremble. The room was well lit, but I stayed smack in the middle. It wasn't until the morning sun shone strong enough through the window that I dared pull my feet back under myself and rise from the ground. I staggered over to the space on the wall where the dryer had sat, to the 1 foot wide hole that had been staring at me like a black void throughout the night. I didn't dare reach in, but I did peek. Money. Stacks of it. From the floor up, halfway to the ceiling. I didn't touch a dime. The Higgins family found the bodies a couple weeks later, when they arrived to set up an estate sale. No one knew what to say besides a robbery gone wrong, though how it went that wrong was impossible to explain. I was questioned, of course, being so close to the victims. I don't think anyone ever really suspected me, though. How could one 20-year-old kid tear two people apart like that? A couple months have passed now, and I still don't sleep well. Just a few minutes in the dark is too much for me, and when I do finally drift off, all I can see is Danny's body, or Parker's intestines strung along the dining room table like garland. Sometimes I drive by Prairie Dreams and see Mrs. Higgins staring out from her window. She always meets my eyes dead on and gives me a sad, knowing sort of smile. And sometimes, in the dead of the night, I swear I still hear screaming. My Uncle Gary lives up in Alaska and always tells me about these native stories about creatures and monsters. I never believed them until I experienced it for myself, and by God do I regret not believing him. I would visit my Uncle Gary once a year for about a month in the winter, normally January or February, when I didn't really have much to do and school wasn't really as important to me. I would typically arrive the night before the first of the month. I showed up on January 31st that year and I slept once I got there, and then woke up and got out to do stuff. We would snowmobile up to great views of snowy plains and nice high mountains. I remember when we came back to the cabin, we would always sit down and enjoy a nice hot bowl of soup or stew filled with chunks of moose and sometimes even bear. Then him and I would relax and bullshit for a while watching TV at the cabin. My Uncle Gary didn't like going out the night before it was supposed to snow, and he didn't like going out while it was snowing. He always told me there was something that hunted in the snow, that even bears feared, and for something to scare a bear, it must be something bigger than them. I remember the day it happened. It was January 18th, 2019. It had just downpoured about a foot of snow on the ground, and we were just cleaning up and prepping dinner for that night. Above the sink in the kitchen was a window about 2 feet tall and about 4 feet wide. I watched over the backyard to the tree lines in the back. I always told my uncle that I wanted to go out back into those trees. My uncle put his hand on my shoulder and told me, "Those woods, I don't even go in. My grandfather died in those woods from something." Nobody ever found a culprit behind the killings, but they claimed that a supernatural force had killed him. My uncle and I walked outside to go get some stuff out of the small ice chest we had made. As we started to pick things out of the chest, it began to snow, and not like a light little dusting, but an absolute blizzard. We rushed back to the house and slammed the door shut. That was too close. We nearly got caught outside during the hunt. My uncle spoke, shivering just a little. "The hunt?" I asked as I carried the half-frozen bear meat to the cutting board to try and cut it up for the stew. His brow furrowed as he turned to me. "I've gotten caught in one of these blizzards, and I was nearly a victim to this thing." He walked over to me and washed his hands. "What thing?" I asked, looking up and out the window, and what neither of us realized until later that week, that it was already hunting something, and it wouldn't stop until it caught its prey. I finished cutting up the bear meat and threw it into the giant cast iron pot. I then cut up the carrots and the onions, the potatoes, and then my mix of spices that I still keep a secret. I let it stew on the stove, stirring it every 20 minutes, and then soon finished the meal in about an hour, letting it get thickened up and then making fresh fettuccine noodles to serve with the stew. My uncle was always impressed with my culinary skills. He always told me that I should go to culinary school and become a chef. I laughed and told him my parents would never let me do that. He gave me a pat on the back and smiled. Do what you want to do, my boy. Don't let your parents smash your culinary dream. I smiled and we sat down in the den and ate our bowl of stew. Hey, Uncle Gary. I spoke up as he finished his bite of stew. What's up, Jay? He said as he prepared to take the next bite of stew. What's that thing you were talking about that lives in the woods behind the house that apparently killed your grandpa? He stopped and put his fork with food back into the bowl and set it down on the table. Jay, I don't really like talking about it, but since you and I spend so much time together, I think it's about time I tell you. He spoke as he looked at the bear head above the fireplace. I turned and looked at that head and noticed the claw marks on the side of the bear's face. Was it that thing that made those claw marks? I asked as I turned to look at my Uncle Gary. Yes, that is the only one of the things he's done. Now follow me and leave your stew here. You need to see this. He stood up and walked over to the closet by the door to the den and opened the door and stood by the door. Over here. He motioned for me to come over, and I do as he grabs the small rug on the floor and pulled it out and grabbed a small handle on the backside and opened a hatch in the floor. I looked to him as I stepped down the hatch and he follows behind me, turning on the lights as I looked to the walls. It looked like a criminal investigation board. It had drawings, witness accounts, trail camera photos, strings around it connecting things. Uncle Gary, what is all this? I said, blown away, not expecting to see all this in my uncle's home. This, my boy, is just what you think it is. An investigation board. He said, walking over to the table in the middle of the room and ushering me over. I walked towards him and stand over the table with him. On the table was a satellite photo of the surrounding area with marks, dates, symbols, and a bunch of different names of people. I turn and look at the photos on the wall. Is this it? I ask him, putting my finger on a picture. He sighed and walked towards me. Yeah, that's it. He stood and pointed to an X on the map. That's where the picture was taken last month, about a mile north of here. I take an even more detailed look at the picture and I see something in the picture. Hey, Uncle Gary, did you see this? He looks at where I point and he sees what I'm looking at. In its grasp, it looked like a leg of something. Is that denim? I think so, but if that's denim, that means that's a person's leg. But it looks like that leg goes off the camera's range and there is no end of the leg, so either whoever it has lost their entire leg, or this thing is dragging them away. I explain as I step back and look at the map again. So it was taken here a month ago, you said. So whoever it is probably is dead by now. I sigh and step towards the table. Has there been any missing persons reports in the area? Putting my hands on the table, trying to decipher and figure out the mystery behind this thing. It's Alaska. We are known as the land of the missing. So there are a lot of missing people in the state. Figuring out who it is going to be almost impossible. He spoke as he walked towards the stairs back up to the house. Come on, we can do something about this another day. Let's finish enjoying that stew you made. He smiled as I walked with him to the stairs, and we walked back up to the den. As soon as we stepped up into the den, we heard a howling noise from outside. Just a wolf pack wandering through the area. We walked back to the couches and sat down and began to enjoy the rest of our dinner. We finished our stew and Uncle Gary told me stories of when he was a young boy with his grandfather. All the hunts they went on, and how he learned to skin and butcher animals for food and how to make their hides into blankets and rugs. He had even showed me how to do the exact same thing while I was with him. After we went to bed, I couldn't fall asleep. I laid in bed and thought about what I had seen under the hatch. I got up from bed and put on my slippers and walked to the closet and took the rug out and opened the hatch and went down into the room. I turned on the light and walked to the table and put my hands down on it. We have to be missing something. I groan as I go up to the kitchen and get a drink and go back down into the room. I sit down in the chair and think for a few moments before standing up and walking over to the board and comparing all the things I see. The witness accounts linking up with others, and the date of the sightings and the trail camera photos, and all the marks on the map. Wait a minute, I said as I looked at 3 different witness accounts and grabbed a pencil off the table, and looked at the locations of the sightings and noticed something. All those sightings were about a half mile away from each other, And the thing was, my grandpa's cabin was right in the middle of it. It formed a triangle around the cabin, and I was surprised my uncle hadn't noticed this. But what is the connection with this and that thing? I sighed and walked to the desk and sat down again. If the sightings made a triangle around the cabin, then there must be something in or around this cabin that this thing is attracted to. I said as I started looking around the room, is there something in here it might be looking for? I start looking in the containers and I don't find anything. If it isn't looking for something, then maybe it lives in these woods. That's when I realized something. Uncle Gary and his grandfather died in the woods behind the cabin. The first sighting was in the woods behind the cabin, and that's where we got the trail camera photo from. And these cabins are its hunting grounds. And one of the cabin owners just so happened to be outside when this beast was on the hunt. I stood up and walked over to the photos. So if this photo was taken here facing here, that would mean that cabin would be abandoned. That's where we need to go tomorrow. I spoke as I grabbed my drink and turned the lights out and headed back upstairs. I shut the hatch and walked back to the bedroom and laid down and went to sleep. After I woke up that morning, I made breakfast for my uncle and then I looked to him. So I made a discovery last night, Uncle Gary. He turned to me and took a bite of his food. What's that, my boy? He said as he looked at me with his fork full of sausage gravy. After breakfast, I'll show you. It's hard to explain without showing you. I spoke as I took a bite from my biscuit. We finished our biscuits and sausage gravy and headed down to the hatch in the room. As we entered the room, I clicked the light on and walked towards the map on the wall. So what did you find out last night? He said as he crossed his arms next to me. I pointed to the triangle I drew on the wall. After looking at everything that you've found out, I'm surprised you didn't see this. I tapped on each of the cabins, and I think it was then that he started to put two and two together. So from what you're showing me, those triangles in the entire area, it's been spotted in. And right between all of the cabins is the woods out back. I looked at him and facepalmed. Uncle Gary, I swear you're dumb sometimes. I sighed and slapped him on the back. He laughed and gave me a pat on the back as well. No. I looked at him and pointed to the cabin to the northwest of ours. While I was looking at this map last night, I had an idea. You know how the picture of the creature had that leg in it? He nodded as I continued. Well, the camera was pointed this way towards the northmost cabin, and I did a little digging and figured out that the man that lives in that cabin was an older gentleman. I believe that the person that the creature has is that man from that north cabin. He looked at me and patted me on the back again. You're such a smart kid, Jay. And I'm proud of you. Do you think we should go and investigate his cabin? I nodded and grabbed my knife off the table and stuck it in my pocket. We walked and climbed the steps back up into the den. Together we walked over to the gun cabinet, and he handed me a rifle and he grabbed his shotgun. Here, I think you'll need this, just in case anything happens. He hands me a handgun, a Glock 18, then hands me its holster. I put the holster on and put the handgun in the holster. He grabs his handgun, a .357 Magnum, and puts that in his holster on his hip. We then grab our winter jackets and boots and everything and put them on. We then get up and walk towards the door. He grabs his hat off the hat rack and puts it on as I do the same. You ready, buckaroo? I nod as he opens the door as the snow and wind blows into the cabin. We quickly walk outside and shut the door behind us. He turns and turns on the light outside so we can see the house if it gets dark. We can still see the house that way. We then begin to walk towards the cabin. The snow already began to pick up as the wind whipped past our ears, chilling them as our noses began to run from the cold wind. As we walked, we came across a carcass of a moose, and looking at the way this moose was mutilated was just horrific. Its throat had been torn out and its entire body was torn apart in pieces, the guts all pooling out. The off thing was, we didn't see any blood pooled out into the snow, just the organs starting to get covered by the snow. Uncle Gary, if it was dead for a while, wouldn't the guts have been gone, or the snow had covered them up or something? I said as I turned around and looked around at the trees up on the ridge above us. He turned and looked too. Yeah, it would. He began scanning the ridge line with his shotgun as I scanned the trees around us. Let's just go. We need to get to that cabin before whatever killed this comes back. My uncle nods as we begin going faster towards the cabin. We found a run going up a ridge line. As we climbed it, we heard a loud growl come from behind us. What was that? I said as I aimed my rifle towards the holler we had just come from. He turned and looked at me and said with a stone-cold, serious face, "That's the beast. Uncle Gary, we need to get to that cabin now." I said as I started to go back up and further away from the growl. He nodded as we began to break into a run towards the cabin. As we ran, we heard trees and branches breaking and falling over. "Go, go, go!" He yells as a little building came into view as he got to the door and opened it. As we both got inside, my uncle slammed the door shut as we looked out of the 2 windows the little cabin had. I look out the one window looking towards the area we had just come from. As I looked out the window, I saw it, and at that point, I wished we never left the cabin. It was black, but its hair covered in white due to the snow. Just from the 5 to 10 yards we were from it, I could already tell this thing had long claws coming from its arms, possibly up to 8 inches long. Its body was bulky and built like a professional athlete. Big, curly, muscular black arms, and its face is something that I wished I hadn't seen. Its face resembled that of a wolf, but it wasn't exactly a wolf since it appeared to be bipedal. Its snout contained a vicious amount of teeth. Some of them were white, and when I looked carefully, I noticed that a few were red. It looked like it was hunting for food, and we disturbed its feeding. We stared at it for a moment before it stuck its face up into the air and began to sniff as it lowered its nose and looked towards the cabin. I felt its eyes staring right into my soul, its dead stare freezing me as it started moving towards the cabin. It began to get closer and closer to the cabin as I looked at my uncle. Get behind something and hide. Maybe it won't see us. So I hid in the small wooden closet where there was a hole big enough for me to look out into the room. My uncle hid under the bed, his hand on his shotgun ready to put up a fight. As I watched from the closet, I heard the beast scrape its long claws against the wooden walls of the small wooden building. I heard a growl as I looked towards the door as the door started to crack. A banging came from the door as I saw its hand burst through it, its claws dragging across the wood as its hand pulled away from the door. As the banging grew louder, the beast burst it wide open, splintering it into a bunch of pieces as it stood into the room. My uncle froze as he readied his shotgun, and I readied my rifle. The beast walked into the room, stomping onto the small table, crushing it like a peanut. My uncle grabbed a splinter of wood that had blown from the door and threw it to the other side of the room. The beast turned and looked at where the wood had landed. My uncle looked at me in the closet as he crawled out, jumped up, and fired his shotgun, the pellets striking the beast in the back. I kicked open the door and aimed my rifle downrange and fired 3 bullets towards the beast. The beast never even flinched as we rushed towards the exit, my uncle making out at the front door. I, however, was trapped as the beast lunged for my uncle, blocking the door. I looked for a way out, and I only found one way to escape from the building. That was to go out one of the windows. The bad thing, though, was the windows didn't appear to be able to open, so acting on my fight or flight response, I ran and jumped through the window, the glass shattering and cutting my face. I landed in the snow, the cold snow coating my face as my uncle ran up and grabbed me by my jacket and hauled me to my feet. "Go, get back to the cabin." He yelled as we ran, started to run back to the cabin, the beast's gut-wrenching roar coming from behind us. I tripped and fell into the snow as I heard the crashing and thrashing of the trees and branches as I saw a large black figure of the beast come close. I rolled over and put my gun up and prepared to fire, but when I clicked the trigger, the gun jammed. Damn it. I yelled as I went for my sidearm. I got the sidearm up and fired 3 rounds towards the charging beast. The first bullet didn't seem to do anything, but the second and third seemed to have a small effect on it. Then the beast began to slow down and eventually collapsed into the snow mere inches from me. I crawled back and stood up, pointing my sidearm at the body. My uncle yelled for me and I yelled back as he rushed to my side. "Jay." He got to me and gave me a hug, nearly crying. "Oh my God, you're okay." I sighed and hugged him back. After we broke the hug, we turned around and looked to the beast, seeing as the body started to release what I assumed to be blood. It appeared to be black as I grabbed a small stick and stuck it into the liquid. I pulled it back and held it up, and took a smell of it. The smell of this stuff was putrid, and it began to intensify with each passing second. I dropped the stick and looked to my uncle. Should we keep going to the cabin or head back? He sighed and looked at the body and reached for his phone as he took it out and snapped a picture of the beast's body. I turned and looked at the body, the wind snapping and howling in our ears. But as we calmed down and looked around, a gigantic roar, even louder than the one the beast took down, had just produced. It shook our chests as we turned towards the direction the roar came from. We need to go now, back to the cabin. My uncle yelled as we bolted back towards the direction of the cabin. We kept going, pushing branches and bushes out of the way, as we didn't want to get slowed down, as we knew whatever gave that roar, that beast was behind us. I was scared the entire time, even though I didn't show it at the time. As the cabin came into sight, a tree came flying by us. We ran into the cabin and slammed the door shut. Into the basement. He yelled as he opened the door, and I threw open the hatch and jumped down, my uncle following behind me. He pulled the door shut and climbed down the hatch and shut that as well. We rushed towards the room, and as we got there, we turned the lights on and fully loaded our guns, and I loaded my sidearm. As we reloaded, we heard banging and crashing coming from upstairs. We didn't move. We just kept our sights aimed towards the tunnel from the hatch. We stayed there for what felt like an eternity before we dared even move from that spot. It went silent upstairs as I looked to my uncle and started to move towards the start of the tunnel. We aimed forwards, walking like a military duo. As we approached the hatch, it was still silent. I saw the hatch and reached for the handle when my uncle stopped me. I turned towards him and he nodded to me as I stepped back and he stepped forward. He climbed up the small ladder and slowly opened the hatch. We slowly climbed out of the basement and opened the door to the den. As we stepped up into the den, we looked around us, as we didn't really notice any intense or extreme damage. Looking around, we saw the furniture flipped over and the door busted down in the same way the smaller one was busted down in the other cabin. If other than that, there wasn't really any other damage to the cabin. I walked over and turned one of the chairs back over and sat down and took a breather. I looked to my uncle and sighed. I'm saying this right now. Do not try to hunt this thing or even find it. This thing is powerful and I don't want to ever see this thing as close as I have before. I said as I looked to the small fridge my uncle had in the den. I stood up and walked over to it and opened up the freezer part of it and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. I screwed off the cap and took a swig and handed it off to my uncle. My uncle took it and took a swig from it as well and then put it back. We're sleeping in the basement since we're missing the door. Get your sleeping bag and put it in the basement because we're safe there. I nodded as we grabbed sleeping bags and set them up in the basement. Tomorrow, I think we should fix up this door and maybe go get some more trail cameras set up. I said as I climbed back into the basement and set up my sleeping bag and laid some of my stuff down there. Agreed. I need a door to the house. If I don't, this entire place is useless. We laughed it off as I cooked us dinner that night, with what I could find laying around. I made a nice thing of stir-fry with vegetables and a couple of meats with all the herbs and spices I could use till I made it perfect. I'm glad I have you to cook, Jay. I smiled and sat with him and ate my stir-fry. It ended up being a quiet night that evening. Although the coming days were calmer, but my uncle and I replaced the door. We heard the beast roar off in the distance. A good distance. But we did see a big one coming close to the cabin, but it wasn't acting aggressive. We also, a few days later, went to find that cabin that we hid in from the first beast. Sadly, we couldn't. It just seemed to have vanished from the forest. We followed the exact route we went, and I found the frame of the window I had smashed through with pieces of the glass laying around it, the sun reflecting off the pieces. Where did it go, Uncle Gary? I asked, scratching my head as I turned and looked around like I was lost. I don't know, Jay. It just seemed to vanish. He said as he was just as confused as I was about where the cabin vanished to. Seems this is another mystery that I don't want to solve. I said as I looked out through the many trees surrounding us. It was a beautiful sight to end a horrifying experience. I never told anyone about this experience because it's something that I don't ever want to experience again. I still don't know what it was. A wendigo, a skinwalker, I have no idea what this beast could be. It could be something else entirely, maybe supernatural or spiritual, but my uncle and I have both named them the Shadow Wolves due to their resemblance to wolves. For those wishing to explore Alaska and wanting to find out what's there, I give you one warning and one warning only. Never get caught in a blizzard, or you may just be caught by the horrors within. We were in orbit. We had been for 2 days and 21 hours. It was so calm and peaceful up there. I looked out the window and saw the Earth suspended in a sea of black. It was like it was hanging on a piece of invisible string, and I could see the faint, blue-gray haze that was Earth's atmosphere. We could see whole continents with golden-green ground and deep blue seas. I could see the sun, brighter than a million light bulbs behind us. Trillions of twinkling stars sparkled all around us. The sky was darker than I'd ever seen it before, which only made the sun and distant stars seem even brighter. I turned back around and looked around the shuttle. The gleaming off-white walls were covered in panels, switches, and levers. There were blinking lights and screens all around the walls with an area sectioned off for sleeping quarters. There was a huge jolt and we all bumped up and down. I looked out the window and saw that we had finally reached the moon after 3 days of being in that cramped shuttle. The milky surface gleamed in the sun's reflected light, highlighting every crater, hill, and valley. It stretched for miles and miles, and all of it was covered in this white, milky light that felt like it was putting you into a trance, like staring into a fireplace. The effect was mesmerizing. The hills, big and small, cast long shadows into the valleys and craters, giving it an eerie look. I heard the pneumatic hiss of the door and snapped out of my trance. I jumped out of the shuttle and landed on the surface of the moon. There was a thin film of dust hovering above the ground. That was one of the first things I learnt about the moon, that layer of floating dust. There is no wind, no movement up there to give any reason for it to be there like that, and yet it is. Our mission was to collect some small samples of rock to bring back for testing. This had been done before, so we had no idea why they wanted us to go up again. But they never told us, and we never asked. I guess they were paying us quite well to do this, as Nicola had so often reminded me. Martin was already jumping down the steps to the moon floor, so we followed him. There was no shortage of rock clumps and strange formations around, but none were small enough or of good enough quality to take back with us. I wandered off a bit, hoping to find an acceptable specimen. I walked behind a tall bit of rock to see if there were any small pieces, but there was nothing there. Even the dust had disappeared. I turned around and walked back the way I had come to the shuttle, but it wasn't there. Neither were Martin and Nicola. They were gone. Everything was gone, except for a small building about 200 meters from me. I knew there was something off about this, but for some reason, I wasn't afraid. Instead, I felt curious. There was a sort of gravity radiating from that squat little building, and I could feel it pulling at my mind, even from here. I slowly started to walk towards the building, which, as I got closer, I realized was glowing. I walked a bit faster. My curiosity almost a tangible thing by now. My heart was hammering, but still, I felt no fear. It was the strangest thing. The building was glowing from a central point on the inside, like something, a consciousness of some sort, was in there, and was trying to lure me in. I put my hand on the handle to the door, and even through the spacesuit, I could feel the heat coming off it in waves. The handle got hotter and hotter, but I couldn't pull my hand away. The heat got worse and worse until I thought it might burn me through the suit, but it stopped, all at once. I felt dizzy, almost like I had been sitting down for a while and stood up too quickly, but weirder. I looked around and I was back in the shuttle. I stood completely still, listening for any sound that might indicate I wasn't still utterly alone in this place. I heard nothing. There was absolutely no sound, not even the buzzing and clicking of the engines and power. I walked over to the window, trying to peer out into the inky black, and saw the earth. Only it wasn't my earth. It wasn't the planet I called my home. This was warped somehow, and the closer I tried to look, the fuzzier the image appeared. Like I couldn't look directly at it. Like I wasn't allowed to look directly at it. I could feel my dizziness turn into a pounding headache, and I sat down on a bed, realizing I was in the sleeping quarters. There was still no sound coming from beyond my door, and that twisted earth that wasn't mine was still outside my window. It almost seemed like it was leering at me, laughing at my confusion and the fear I was just now beginning to feel. I wasn't in my spacesuit. Whatever had transported me back here had done something to get rid of it. So I lay down on my bed, trying to fall asleep in case this was just a nightmare. But I couldn't. I lay there for hours trying to sleep, but the more I tried, the more awake I became. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually I realized I could hear faint noise coming from outside my door, getting louder and morphing into the familiar buzzing of the inner workings of the spacecraft. I could hear people talking and walking around. I almost cried with relief and ran to my door, out into the main room. Sat there was Martin and Nicola, looking for all the world like nothing had happened. So I asked them. I asked what had happened, where they had gone, what was that horrible building. But they stared at me blankly, and I could see no light in their eyes. Looking into their cold, dead eyes, I knew that whatever was inside that building, whatever was causing all of this, had gotten to them, and for whatever reason, it had not claimed me too. Martin and Nicola got up, in total synchronicity, and walked towards me with their arms hanging limply at their sides. As they walked towards me, I knew. I could feel in my bones that even though that thing had not claimed me, I was not saved. My fate was to be much worse. I ran faster than I ever had before, straight to the life module. I somehow figured out how to start it through my panic, and it roared to life. It was the most comforting noise I had heard in my entire life. The stress and fear took over me, though, and I passed out. I woke up in the hospital after the module had used autopilot to make its way back to Earth. And it was my Earth, not twisted and wrong in a fundamental level, but mine. I was released from the hospital a week later, the doctors giving me a clean bill of health. Didn't stop them, though. Every night I have the same dream. I dream I'm flying towards the moon in the silent shuttle. I know which building I'm flying to, and I can't stop it. I know that it will claim me eventually, that I can't do anything to stop it.